And they are not very fantastic. And then like every site where you've got to
Okay, there's a homework assignment in, where's it at? Go to lessons. Go all the way to week 9, renal. And there's a homework assignment in here that's due Tuesday. And if you want the PowerPoint slides that are in week number 10, but week number 10 is not in its usual spot, go to lessons and then you go all the way to the bottom. It didn't get rearranged. And the slides are in there. In fact, I'm going to have to go from the slides today because I misplaced my jump drive. Wow, what the heck. There it goes. And where did number 9 go? We still had a few slides left in urinary, right? Just a few? And anyone remember what the last slide we were on was? Too far. We talked about this, right?
start with any tubular segments that are...
This one?
That's where we start. Yeah.
Okay. So the last thing we ended with was this question, what's true about vasopressin? What's the other name for vasopressin?
ADH.
ADH. What's ADH do? It goes to what part of the kidney? It retains water by going to what part of the kidney? It's either going to be the Bowman's capsule, proximal tubule, descending limb, ascending limb, or the distal and collecting duct. It's the distal and collecting duct. It goes to the distal and collecting duct, and does it turn on pumps to move water? Does water ever move by pumps? No. It just pops those holes in the wall so that water can chase what? Salt. What's the name of the chemical that allows you to bring salt back in? Aldosterone, right. Where does aldosterone work? The exact same place, right? So it works at the same place. Aldosterone and vasopressin or ADH work at the same place. Aldosterone brings in the salt. Vasopressin opens holes for what to follow the salt? Water. Okay. All right, and then we already covered, I've said this probably 10 times, so I don't think I need to say it again, but this is the same thing. If salt comes in, what's water do? Goes in following it. What's the name of the process of water moving down a concentration gradient? Osmosis. Right. So if you bring the water in because of the salt, if you lose a lot of salt, what do you lose a lot with it? A lot of water. And then we talked about this in lab last week when we did urinalysis, but there are two types of diuresis. There's water diuresis and osmotic. What does water diuresis look like? Very yellow, very clear, very dark yellow? It's very clear because it's primarily water. So, excuse me, it's very hypotonic, it's very watery and dilute. Osmotic diuresis, what color would it be? Really, really dark, the same as normal, or very, very clear? Very normal. Yeah, it looks normal, but what's their problem? They're just constantly urinating, which means they're losing electrolytes and sodium. All of the things that you normally lose in urine are coming out with it in excessive amounts. What's the other name for many urinations? Polyuria. Okay, so shifting into the last part, renal failure. And renal failure is when one of the kidneys, or actually or both of the kidneys, shut down so much that you can't actually filter the water out anymore. One kidney can actually do the job of 80% of both. That makes sense? So if you lose one kidney, it will still do 80% of the work of what you had with normal two kidneys. It's when you start lowering it down to the point where you can't compensate. Anybody know what the name of the process is? If you lose one kidney, the other one starts growing in size to compensate. We talked about with muscles, hypertrophy. Yep, hypertrophies. Becomes hypertrophic. Okay, and then some of the causes, infectious organisms, so things like bacteria that gets in. Usually when bacteria gets in, it gets in from one of two ways. Either it gets in through the urinary tract, or it can come into the kidneys through the what? How's most stuff get into the kidneys? Through the blood. Yep, so you can either have bacteria in your blood or an infection in the blood, or you can have it come straight up through the urinary tract. Toxic agents, things like aspirin are actually considered a toxic agent. You take too much aspirin too close together and it can start causing renal failure. Oops. Leads will do that, poisons do that. An inappropriate immune response. What are those little things that B cells release? Do you remember? Antibodies. If you get lots and lots of antibodies and they start getting into the kidney, what are antibodies made of? Do you remember? It's either going to be lipids, proteins, or carbs. It's proteins. So are these proteins going to easily filter through? Nope. What are they going to do? So if you have lots of these things in the blood, what are they going to do to the kidney? Think about if, remember, the kidney's like a spaghetti strainer. If I'm trying to strain spaghetti through it, catches the spaghetti, what's going to happen if I put a bunch of rice in with my spaghetti and try and dump it through the strainer? It's going to block it up. Exactly. Those little antibodies are like little pieces of rice and they start plugging the holes. So what's the kidney not going to be able to do? It's not going to filter appropriately anymore. They call that glomerulonephritis. Why do they call it glomerulo? It's affecting the glomerulus. Exactly, the filter. Why do they call it nephra? Because it's part of the nephron, and itis means inflammation. So when you put pieces of the words together, that kind of leads you into pathophysiology. But glomerulonephritis is when the kidneys become inflamed because they're plugged up with something. All right, obstruction of urine flow, that would be another thing, but that would be just like plugging it up with these proteins. But what's another thing that you have to worry about, and it's more common than glomerulonephritis? Kidney stones. Yep. So if you have a lot of those electrolytes and a lot of those little elements that are floating through your system, they start getting into the kidneys, they can stick together and form stones. And then the last one, insufficient renal blood supply. The kidneys need blood too, not just to filter the blood for the rest of the body, but for actually nutrients for the kidney. So things like heart failures, where you would see something like insufficient blood supply. Maybe shock or a hemorrhage. Okay. And then urine. So where it's stored at. Of course, it's processed. It's made in the kidneys. What's the name of that tube that goes down from the kidney into the bladder? The ureter. How many do you have? Two. One in each kidney, if you have two kidneys, that is. But so it follows down the ureter. How does that move? If you read the book or you read the chapter, how does the urine move? Does it just diffuse? It actually moves by a process. What's the same? It's, let me see if I can get you to get here. It's made with smooth muscle. Smooth muscle wraps around it. Peristalsis, exactly. It's peristalsis. It's like a milking behavior, milking the urine down. I feel like I'm. What's that movie with the Fockers?
Oh, yeah. Milking the cat.
Yeah, milking the cat. I don't even know why I did that. Little ureters. All right. Anyway, so when you're starting to fill that, it's going down the ureters, going into the bladder. You're filling up the bladder, and the bladder slowly expands. So the bladder can expand, but it's surrounded by smooth muscle. If you were to expand it quickly, what would it want to do? Snap back. Luckily, you don't expand it very quickly. It slowly stretches, and as it slowly stretches, it receives until it gets about 200 to 400 milliliters of urine, and then it starts going, oh, this is a little too much. What's it going to want to do now? Now it's going to want to contract back. What's interesting is there's a process. So the smooth muscle will actually send a signal to the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends a signal back. What do you call that process of sending a signal from the structure to the spinal cord and back to get a response? It's a reflex. So they call it the Micturition reflex. It's a reflex arc. When your bladder expands, it sends a signal up to the spinal cord, comes back, and it helps you relax one of those little sphincters. When we talked about the sphincters in the GI tract, which one was voluntary? The one outside or the one inside? Outside was voluntary, and so that means the one inside was made out of smooth muscle. It's the same, exactly the same here. The one on the inside is smooth muscle, the one on the outside is skeletal muscle. Which one do you have control over? The skeletal one on the outside. So that instinctive reflex is going to send a signal back to the smooth muscle and cause the smooth muscle to do what? If it contracts, what's going to do to the ureter, the muscle around the ureter? It's going to squeeze down. Or urethra, sorry. It's going to squeeze down. Will you be able to urinate if that happens? No. Your bladder's full and it's trying to say, oh, release, just let go. Luckily, it's just like when we talk about the defecation response. The signal goes to the spinal cord, and as the other signal is coming back to relax a smooth muscle, one signal goes to the brain and tells you, uh-oh. And then your brain sends a signal down and does what to the external urethral sphincter? If you're sitting in your seat right now, what do you want to do to that muscle? Contract it. Well, for women, you can cross your legs and it helps. For men, it doesn't work that much. So the external urethral sphincter is going to contract if you have contact with the brain down to the spinal cord. Who would have a problem with this? People that have had spinal cord injuries, right? So if they can't get the signal from the brain down to the tip of the spinal cord, then as soon as they get that reflex to let go, they just urinate. What other age group, I'm not talking elderly, I guess I should have been really clear there, but what other age group are going to have a problem controlling that reflex? Babies. They haven't developed the myelin sheath as well yet, so they're still working on that pathway between the brain and the reflexes down here. So babies, as soon as their bladder gets full, they just let go of it. It's called the Micturition reflex. So internal urethral sphincter, what do you want to know about that? What's it made out of? Smooth. Voluntary or involuntary? Involuntary. When the bladder fills, that reflex causes this one to relax. When the bladder's full and you're not in the appropriate place, the external urethral sphincter is made out of skeletal, and is it voluntary or involuntary? Voluntary, excuse me. It's voluntary. And of course the reflex is the same thing. What kind of receptor would you start with? Not for pressure. So baro would be for pressure. This is detecting stretch, exactly. So you start with a stretch receptor. That signal goes up to the spinal through a what kind of neuron? I think I already heard it. An afferent neuron, right? So a sensory neuron going up to the spinal cord, and then it crosses over, comes out through what kind of? An efferent, goes back to the effector, which is going to be your internal urethral sphincter, and causes it to relax. And then the voluntary control comes from the brain. Urinary incontinence is when you lose that control. And you can have an intact spinal cord, you can have a working brain, you can have good communication, but sometimes if you wait too long, what could happen? It just accidentally goes. So urinary incontinence, there's something called overflow, where you keep too much urine in there, and then there's a point where you just can't control it anymore, it just forces its way out. You could have spinal cord damage, causing incontinence. Even things like STDs, syphilis, can cause urinary incontinence. Syphilis gets into your neurons and starts traveling towards your brain. So it starts affecting the spinal nerves, starts affecting the nerves going up into the brain, and can actually affect your brain too. Back around the turn of the century, syphilis was a problem, and then we came up with what drug? Penicillin. And guess what? Penicillin doesn't work as well as it used to, so syphilis is coming back. Syphilis, the sequel. Okay, so there are different types of incontinence, and it depends on the pathway. You could have damage at the level of the spinal cord, and then you just constantly are emptying. You don't even have to worry about a reflex. And then here's just the pathway that we talked about. So bladder fills, the stretch receptors start stimulating that pathway. The parasympathetic nerve goes up into the spinal cord, comes back down to the bladder, and tells the bladder to do what? This is your basic instinct, your autonomic response. What's it going to tell? It's going to say, go ahead and, evacuate. Go ahead and clear it. So it's going to contract the bladder. What's it going to do to that internal urethral sphincter? Relax it. Yep, it relaxes it. Luckily, there's a signal that goes from the brain down and goes to the external urethral sphincter and tells it to squeeze until you're in the appropriate place. So here's kind of a chart. You can see the stretch. You have a quick stretch, and then you have this mild kind of low stretch for a while. And as soon as you get up here, like 200 to 400 milliliters, then your bladder says, time to go. And the more you fill at that point, the more the sensation to let go is. So typically between 200 and 400 milliliters is when your bladder says it's time to release. I worked for a short time in an ER, and they had this little competition when it was busy to see who could hold their bladder the longest, and whoever could urinate the most at one time was the winner. Not a good idea. All right. So what's due by the time we come back next Tuesday? Homework and quiz number 10. Right, quiz number 10 is already. The homework and the quiz number 10, there are questions in the homework and the quiz that are actually on the test. Just saying.
Say
What? Huh? What? Did I do that right? Was it what?
Say
What again?
Did you get
Is that better? Lecture 8, the little digestion one, I don't know what happened. It's on here somewhere, but I don't even know where it's at. I have the people in the library do it. And apparently they uploaded, but maybe something was wrong with the file. Okay, in lab we're going to talk about fluid, acid, base, balance. The only thing we're not talking about in lab are the acid-base disturbances. So we're going to talk about those now. Then we're going to talk about energy and temperature balance. And I recorded the fluid and the acid-base balance from lab, so we'll have that posted. But the whole point of this section is pretty much a review of a lot of things and putting all the concepts we've talked about together. So what are the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, and the renal system? How do they work together? And we're going to focus on that. So we're on page, looks like 117 right now, but we're going to skip ahead to page. Yep, then we'll skip ahead to 123. So for those of you in lab, you've already seen this slide, and I'm not going to go beyond this slide for the beginning, but what you're looking for all the time is input has to equal output. You're maintaining your internal environment. What's that called? Homeostasis. Balance is all about homeostasis. And the way your book is designed, it revolves around homeostasis between all the systems. So at the very end of each chapter, you can see they come back and they talk about how this chapter or this system relates to all the other ones you've talked about. This chapter specifically starts putting everything together and talking about homeostasis again. It's looking for a stable balance of the entire internal environment. What you put into your body, you have to get out the same amount. Exactly. It's the same thing with temperature. If you gain too much heat, you have to do what? You have to lose to get back to normal. If you gain too much water, you have to get rid of that same amount of water. So it's all about balance. When we talk about acids and bases, if you gain too much acid, you need to do what? This is the tricky one. You either need to get rid of that acid or increase your base. It's about balance again. And I always think of acids and bases like a teeter-totter. You want to keep that thing perfectly level. If the acid starts getting dominant and pushing down, what's the base going to have to do? Push down equally, right, to bring it back. Or what's the acid going to have to do? Let go a little bit. So the acid is going to have to get out of your body a little bit to bring it back to balance. If your input exceeds your output, we call it a positive balance. If your calorie input exceeds your output, what do we call it? Getting fat. Right. If your calorie output exceeds your input, what do we call it? Getting skinny. Right? It's a negative balance. If you exceed your input, no matter what it is, it's called a positive balance. If you exceed with the output, it's called a negative balance. Your ultimate goal is to have the stable balance, which we call homeostasis. Right. And then, like I said, we'll talk about water balance in lab. Ding, 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 ding. We'll talk about general acids and bases in lab, but right now we're going to just talk about the disorders revolving around acid and base, which is right there. So when you're trying to maintain acids and bases in your body, and we've been talking about this all week, we talked about with the respiratory system, we've talked about with the kidney system. This is just what happens if those two systems lose their ability to regulate things. So this is called the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. You have to memorize it. I'm kidding, I know, right? No way. You don't have to memorize it. You have to understand it, though. So the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, a couple scientists, math guys got together and they're like, how can I make pre-med, nursing, health science, anybody's students suffer? Let's come up with this really crazy equation. So it's trying to describe what the acid to base ratio is in your body. And what they were actually looking at was primarily the acids. So what happens when you have too much acid or too little acid? What's going to happen to your balance of your blood? The magic number you want to remember for your blood, the pH, which is what we're measuring, is the pH scale, is 7.4. That's the average blood pH. What's perfectly neutral? 7, because the scale goes from 0 to 14. What's very acidic? 0 or 14? 0 is extremely acidic. 14 is extremely basic. So 7, exactly 7 is perfectly neutral. So your blood is just slightly basic, just slightly basic. When they came up with this, there are two ways you can look at this equation. Some people that you'll work with down the road, they'll refer to it as the ratio. So what's the normal ratio of acids to bases? And the base should be 20 parts for every 1 part of acids, one way they'll refer to it. Using the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, they calculate pH equals 6.1 times the log of 20 divided by 1. Don't worry about memorizing that. The big picture here is this log. So when you take something by a log, you start moving it exponentially. You start making big jumps. So if I take the pH scale and I'm at 7, and I go from 7 to 6, it jumps from 1 time to 10 times the normal amount. If I go from 6 to 5, it goes 10 times higher. So if I go from 7 to 5, how many times did I change this factor? It's 10 times 10 times, which is what? 100 times. I'm going to jump back to this scale real quick. I'm going to make somebody dizzy, I know. But when you look at the scale here, there's 7, perfectly neutral. If I take it from 7 to 6, that's 10 times more acidic. If I take it from 6 to 5, it's another 10 times. So when you look at your pH of your blood around 7 and your pH of your stomach acid around 2, about how many times more acidic is your stomach acid than your blood?
50 times.
So we've got 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. Quick math would be 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times more acidic. Is that a big difference? It's a huge difference. Does changing this number just a little bit from 7 to 6 make much of a difference? 10 times difference. It makes a huge difference. So when your blood moves out of that range of 7.4, you start having problems. What little protein chemicals that we talked about all through digestion are not going to work properly when you change the pH? Enzymes. Remember when we talked about pepsin? Pepsin's ideal environment's at a pH of 2. Does it work in the small intestine at a pH of 8? Nope. So if I take the pH of the blood at 7.4 and I start putting it down closer to 6, all those enzymes in the blood, the things that convert CO2 into acid and bicarbonate, the enzyme that helps you hold on to oxygen in your hemoglobin, all those proteins like albumins, they start changing their shape. Are they going to work anymore? Nope. It starts causing big problems. What are protein transporters made out of? He's a quick one. Those protein pumps, the sodium-potassium pump, where I was going. The sodium-potassium pump that helps you run the neurons in your brain, what are they made out of? They're made out of proteins. So if you start changing the pH, are they going to work efficiently anymore? No, they're not going to work. Everything that's made out of a protein is not going to work properly. So if you start changing your pH of your blood, it becomes very, very, very problematic. And it's just a little change. In fact, if you go from 7.4 to 6.8, you're circling the drain. So you're borderline of being dead. If you take it the other way and go from 7.4 just up to 8, you're borderline dead. It's hard to recover from that. So if you're borderline 8, what state are you falling into? Acidosis or alkalosis? Alkalosis. What if you're at 6.8? Acidosis. Yep. And so I'm going to jump straight up to the acidosis and alkalosis, and we'll talk about those. So like I said, there are 2 ways you want to remember it. You want to remember the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, just that the significance of this is that when you change it from 7 to 6 or from 7 to 8, it makes a huge difference. And it's on a logarithmic scale, so it's a big, significant change. A little bit of a change makes a big difference. The other thing is this ratio. When I found this is like exactly the way that my mind thought when I looked at that ratio. I went 20 to 1. Holy crap. So if you have 20 bases in one acid, they neutralize each other and they bring you to perfect balance. Does that seem right? 20 to 1 makes it balance? And I started thinking, well, the 20 to 1 ratio is like, what if one is made out of feathers and one's made out of lead? Which one's heavier? A pound of feathers or a pound of lead?
It's the same.
They're exactly the same. So I always think of the acids and the bases. The acid is extremely powerful. It contributes more weight to this equation. The base, not as powerful. It's like the feathers. It's going to take more volume to actually make the same difference. So when I look at this equation, it has a 20 divided by 1, basically. You can plug this into your head and say, okay, 20 divided by 1, what's a normal ratio? It would be coming out at 20, right? If I go above the 20, so I raise this from 20 to 1, we'll say, to 40 to 1, what's the ratio turn into? What's 40 divided by 1? 40. When I move it up like that, what did I change? Base or the acid? I changed the base. What increased? Alkaline or acidity? The alkaline. What state am I in now? Alkaline. Anytime your ratio goes above, so when you see that word above, when people are talking about their pH ratio went above, they mean that they're becoming more alkaline. If they ever say it went below, they're becoming more acidic. And the reason I told you to think of this is because there are 2 perspectives you can look at. You can either, to make you more alkaline, you can either raise the base, or you can do what? Lower the acid. So looking at the final product of this little tiny equation helps you the most. If this equation goes above 20, then you know they're alkaline. If it goes below 20, you know they're basic. What is this base, by the way? Bicarbonate. Yep. So when you take a sample of their blood and you're looking at what's in their blood that contribute the most to acids and bases, the base that you're looking at is bicarbonate. Right? one thing that contributes the most to acids is going to be what? CO2. And then this little picture in the bottom is blown up on the next several slides, but we're going to look at that. So when everything's perfectly balanced, this is like the teeter-totter. You've got 20 parts of the base over here with 1 part of acid over here. It keeps it nice and balanced. If I start holding my breath, which side is going to get heavier? Yep, the CO2 side. So what's going to happen? Am I going to go to alkalosis or acidosis? Acidosis. If it's because of CO2, put this in your notes, CO2 is primarily controlled by what organ in your body? The lungs. So it's acidosis, but we want to know what's causing the acidosis, not just the fact that it's acidosis. So what's the organ causing the acidosis? The lungs. So if you start accumulating too much CO2, what are the lungs probably doing or not doing? What are the lungs probably doing or not doing if you're accumulating CO2 in your blood? They're not pushing it out. So either they're slowing down their breathing too slow, or there's something blocking the airway, or there's something blocking the blood flow to the lungs. It's the lungs that are broken. They're not getting CO2 out efficiently, so you keep accumulating CO2. So if you did this equation, if you went from 1 to 20, now you're at 2 to 20, what's that equation come out to? 20 divided by 2 is 10. Above or below 20? It's below, so it has to be acidosis. It's just a way to double check what you think you know. If it comes out where it's lower than 20 is that equation, then you know it's an acidosis. If it's because of CO2, you know it's what type of acidosis? Dink. Respiratory. The other way you can affect that, if it's respiratory, what chemical are we affecting here? Carbon dioxide. So what if you're blowing too much CO2 out? What's going to happen to this equation? You have more CO2 in your body or less? Less. So if you cut that in half, like this example down here, now it's 20 divided by 0.5. Do you know what that is? It's 40. So is that alkalosis or acidosis? Alkalosis. It's way too high. That ratio is too high. It causes alkalosis. Right? Both of these are affecting CO2, so you know it's what organ? It's lungs. So if it's too much CO2 in the blood, it's respiratory acidosis. If it's too little CO2 in the blood, it's respiratory alkalosis. Metabolic is everything else. We're going to kind of point fingers at one organ that contributes to this, but it's basically everything else. So if it's metabolic, it's because the bicarbonate level's off in your body. So CO2, you can see in both of these equations are exactly the same. But what happens if you take away half that weight of feathers? What becomes more heavy? The lead, which is the acid side, right? So the acid starts pulling down. It's heavy, lots and lots of acid. What state are you going into? Acidosis. Did your CO2 level change, though? Nope. So what is it? It's got to be that metabolic. It's other. It could be because the kidneys are failing. It could be because your carbonic anhydrase inside your red blood cells aren't working. So it could be not just the kidneys, it could be something else in your body. Don't want to update. Right? And the same problem here. If you double your amount of bicarbonate, now it's more powerful. Now what is more powerful? Doubling your bicarbonate, it's the base. Yeah, the base is weighing down. So what state are you in? Alkalosis. Is it because of CO2 changing? CO2 didn't change, so it has to be bicarbonate and it has to be metabolic. Okay, so this is kind of what I already told you, but now it's written in your notes so you don't have any reason not to remember it. But a change in pH that has respiratory cause associated with what? The CO2. Yep, if it's metabolic, it's associated with bicarbonate. And when that ratio of bicarbonate to CO2 falls below 20, what is it? It's an acidosis. Do you know whether it's respiratory or metabolic right now? If it falls below 20, you don't know yet. If it falls below 20 and you notice that the reason it fell below 20 was because you have a lot of CO2, what's the problem? It's the lungs. It's respiratory acidosis. Yep. And if the ratio goes greater than 20 to 1, it's alkalosis. And what if it goes greater than 21 because you have too much bicarbonate? It's metabolic. Metabolic what? Over 20. Yep, so it's alkalosis, metabolic alkalosis. All right, and these are in your notes too, so you can kind of just fill in the blanks, but a ratio less than 20 to 1 you already know is going to be acid. If it's because of the CO2, you know it's because of what organs? The lungs. And it's primarily because of hypoventilation. What's that mean? In layperson terms, it means they're breathing very slowly, or they're getting slow exchange. All right, and then the compensatory measures, and this is where the PowerPoint slide is more handy because it goes one at a time. But first, you want to think of what the body's going to do to try and stop this. First, you're going to have things called chemical buffers, and the chemical buffers work fast, within seconds. And as soon as they see that the CO2 starts accumulating, they're going to go, uh-oh, let's try and buffer this, and they're going to turn it into carbonic anhydrate, or acid, bicarbonate anhydrase, and then they're going to turn it into that bicarbonate and free acids. Okay? They're going to try and bind up those free acids. If they don't work, if the chemical buffers aren't working within seconds, the acids start accumulating. You need a backup plan. Okay? The lungs should help you fix it, but what's causing the problem? The lungs. So can they help you fix it if they're the problem? Nope. So the lungs have no effect. You can't compensate and you can't correct it with the lungs if the lungs are the problem. So what's the fallback organ that we talked about all last week? The kidneys. Yep. So the renal. But the problem with the renal is it takes hours to potentially a whole day for it to make a difference. So renal is really slow. It's powerful, but it's really slow to work. Right? And then how the kidneys are going to do it, and we kind of talked about this. Are you ever going to reabsorb acid? I'm going to get that out right now. No, you can only secrete acid. So if you have too much acid in your blood, can you secrete acid to get rid of it? No. You can only secrete acid. You can't reabsorb it, right? So yes, you can secrete it. What's going to happen to your pH of your urine? It becomes more acidic because you're trying to get rid of the acid from the blood and put it into the urine. Right? If you have too much acid in the blood, what do you want to try and accumulate in the blood to compensate? Base. What's the base we keep pointing finger at? Bicarbonate. So the kidney can actually make brand new bicarbonate and put it in the blood, and it can also reabsorb bicarbonate. So the kidney is really handy for pulling in bases. And that's respiratory acidosis. So what causes it and how you fix it. Next, respiratory alkalosis. What's the cause already? It's the lungs. So if the ratio goes above 20 to 1, so 21, 22, 23, 40, it doesn't matter. And it's because of the CO2, we know it's respiratory, and because it's above 20 to 1, it's alkalosis. So just the opposite, hyperventilation. So breathing out too fast. What are you blowing out too much of? CO2. If you blow out too much CO2, what becomes more powerful in your blood? The base. So it's alkalosis. And because it's the lungs that are doing it, can the lungs fix it? Nope. So hopefully those chemical buffers try to stop it. And what they do is they try and free up acids. It's alkalosis. Now you want to make acid to do what to the base? Neutralize the base. So right away these little chemical buffers that are all through your body, you're going to try and fix it. But if they don't work, can the lungs fix it? Nope, the lungs are the problem. So what has to fix it? The kidney. And the kidney, it's going to try and conserve. I didn't say reabsorb, I said conserve, which means you're not going to do what with the acid? You're not going to secrete it. You stop secreting the acid. You're still going to lose some acid into your urine by filtration, but you can't tubular secrete it. So you just stop releasing acid. What you're going to try and do is you're going to try and pump out what? If you're too basic in your blood, you're going to try and get rid of the bicarbonate at the base. All right. Next one's metabolic. So metabolic acidosis. What's to blame? CO2 or bicarbonate? Bicarbonate. Right. If it's CO2, remember it's always respiratory. So now it's bicarbonate. If it's acidosis, what happened to the ratio? Below 20 or above 20? It's below 20. So it's below 20 to 1. Some of the causes, diabetes mellitus. What do you technically call that? Diabetic. What's causing the acids? We talked about it in lab last week with urinalysis. Ketone acidosis, yep. So things like acetone, they're accumulating way too many ketone bodies. Strenuous exercise, so exercising like crazy. What are they making that's causing this acidic environment?
Lactic acid.
Lactic acid, yep. So their bicarbonate numbers not keeping up with the lactic acid production. Another cause, we talked about it when we talked about the GI tract, what causes acidosis? Vomiting or diarrhea? So in vomiting, you lose too much acid. So does that cause acidosis?
No.
Nope. So what is it?
Diarrhea.
Diarrhea. What are you losing too much of? Too much base. Remember in the large intestine you have that sodium bicarbonate. You're urinating. It's a trick. So you're getting rid of too much sodium bicarbonate. You're losing too much base with diarrhea. So the acid stays behind and causes acidosis. Right. Does that help? Okay, so how do you compensate for it? Those chemical buffers that work within seconds, hopefully they're binding the acid. They're sticking to the acid. And if you've had lab already, I probably told you my teddy bear story. So remember the acid, the hydrogen ion, the only thing it has in its entire universe is this little tiny electron. Somebody stole it. These chemical buffers, they contribute the electron back. And I always use I anamorph the hydrogen and say the hydrogen's like, its one possession is like its teddy bear. If you steal its teddy bear, it's going to be angry. And it's going to try and hurt other things. That's why mean people are born, is because somebody took their teddy bear when they were a kid. Or mean people are created, I guess. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to neutralize that acid, that H+. You give it an electron back and it's neutralized. That's the chemical buffer. Can the lungs fix metabolic acidosis? Yeah, there was nothing wrong with the lungs. But now you have to think about why would they breathe faster? What are they trying to do? And metabolic acidosis says increased respiration. Why would they turn up their respiration? They're trying to blow CO2 out. When you blow out CO2, what goes with it? The acid. Yep. And then can the kidneys fix metabolic acidosis? Yes, if it's not. The kidneys can fix it as long as it's not what causing it? The kidneys causing it. Right. So if there's nothing wrong with the kidneys, they'll help. So if the lungs can't take care of it, the kidneys step in and try and help. If it's because of broken kidneys, then it's all dependent on the respiratory function. But how the kidneys fix acidosis, what are they going to do to acids? They're going to secrete the acid. They're going to push more acid out. So they filter the acid out into the filtrate and into the urine, and then they're also going to tubular secrete it into the filtrate in the urine. And then with bases, what are you going to do with the base? If it's acidosis, what do you want to do with bases? Do you want to lose them? Nope, you want to keep them. So the kidney's going to bring the base back in, the bicarbonate, into your blood to try and neutralize the acids as it can. And then it's also going to make brand new bicarbonate and push it into the blood. Metabolic acidosis. And the next one, metabolic alkalosis. What happened to the ratio? Higher or lower than 20? Higher. So the ratio 20 to 1 goes up. And what is it obviously not? If it's metabolic, it's not because of not the lungs and not what chemical? Not CO2. So it's all about the bicarbonate. And then we talked about diarrhea causing the metabolic acidosis, so vomiting. Why vomiting? Why would it cause alkalosis? Because you're losing the stomach acids. Where did the stomach acid come from? Borrowed from the plasma. So now the plasma is losing all of its acid to the stomach, and the stomach's losing the acid to the environment, so the base becomes very dominant in your body. Can the lungs fix that? What would they start doing? So if it's alkalosis, what's their breathing going to do? It's going to slow down. They're going to slow their breathing. They take really shallow, slow breaths. Why? They're trying to conserve the CO2, right? They're trying to keep the acids into their body to try and neutralize these bases. And then as long as it's not the kidneys can help fix it. So the kidneys are trying to conserve. So are they reabsorbing acid? No, because they can't, right? They can't reabsorb acid. All they're going to do is stop secreting it. Right? And then you start pushing bicarbonate out. So if it's alkalosis and it's too much bicarbonate, you just start urinating out more bicarbonate. Helps balance it out. All right, so if you got a question like this, if a person has metabolic acidosis, the body will compensate in all of the following ways except. So first, it's metabolic acidosis. What's the ratio? Higher or lower than 20 to 1? It's less than 20 to 1, so it's under 20 to 1. What's the cause? Too much bicarbonate?
Too much acid.
Metabolic. What's the focus? It's not the CO2, the acid. The focus is the base. If it's metabolic acidosis, what's happening to your base? You don't have enough. You don't have enough bicarbonate. So what do you want to do with the bicarbonate? You want to start keeping it. What organ's going to keep it? The kidneys. Yep. What's your lung going to try and do? If it's acidosis, what's your lung going to try and do? Get rid of it by doing what? Breathing heavier. Yep. And then how about those little chemical buffers? What are they going to do to the acids? Free them up or bind them? So how about number 1? True or false? Buffers will try and bind the acid. That one's true. How about the respiration rate will decrease? Why? What would respiration rate decreasing do? That would increase the acids, right? You're holding more CO2 in, which is just adding fire to the fire. So number 2 is the correct answer, because your body won't do that. Number 3, reabsorb bicarbonate from the urine. We already said that. And then secrete acid into the urine. Can it secrete acid into the urine? Sure can. It can't reabsorb.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. All right, so if a person hyperventilates, it could result in which of the following? First, think about it. Hyperventilating, what are they doing? Breathing really heavy, right? So what are they doing? Are they affecting their bicarbonate or CO2? CO2. What is it already? It's already respiratory, because we know it's the CO2 related. And if they're blowing too much CO2 out, what are they losing with it? Acid. So what state are they falling into?
Alkalosis.
Alkalosis. So respiratory alkalosis. Right. And that's acid-base imbalances. And we'll go through acid and base again in lab if you haven't had lab yet today. Okay, and energy balance. So this revolves around those calories. Good. I have determined that calories are a direct measurement of the deliciousness of food. Yeah, the fewer the calories, the suckier the food is, right? The more calories, the more delicious it is. All right, so energy balance. And most of your energy that you're bringing in are through the form of calories, of course, and you're trying to get them out through 2 things, work and heat. Okay? We talked about this in muscles, too. If you're sitting perfectly still, are you working? Nope, but are you producing heat? Yes. So it's a physics thing. You have to actually do some kind of a movement somewhere to actually create work. Right? So most of your inputs, because of your calories that you take in, whether they're proteins, carbs, or fats, it doesn't matter. Right? And then the output's primarily through some kind of work or heat. So external work's when we're moving across, the room, walking across the room, lifting weights, jogging, playing basketball, whatever you're doing, where you're moving your body. Internal work's when you're moving things within the cell. So little biochemical processes where you're moving things. Your cell, remember, is like a little tiny city. You're moving things constantly back and forth. You're using energy to do that. So external work, contracting muscles, internal work, all other forms of biological energy expenditures. And then down here at the bottom, most of the energy is ultimately converted into heat. Our bodies are really efficient machines, but we're not perfect machines. So when you're actually doing work, about 50% of the energy is being transferred to ATP. The other 50% is just burned off as heat. So you take in food energy, you put all those chemicals in your metabolic pool. You can store them. If I eat a cheeseburger, what are the 3 forms of storage for energy? Fats, that's a big one. Carbohydrates, as in glycogen, and proteins in the form of muscle. And if you need energy, you'll take it from the fats, you'll take it from the carbs, and then you'll also take it from the muscle. So if you're on a strict calorie limited diet, do you just lose fat? Nope. You start losing fat, and then you start losing muscle mass, so it all starts shrinking down. That's why when you're trying to build muscle, what do they tell you to do? You work out, and then you do what? You get like a ton of calories in the form of proteins, right? You're trying to bring the proteins back in that you're burning off. Right? And then there are your 2 forms of work, internal and external. And the internal work you see primarily as thermal energy or heat. So when your metabolism goes up. You ever seen somebody with high metabolism? Like people that are hyperthyroid? They're always constantly, what about their body temperature? If they're hyperthyroid, they're hot. They're like heat intolerant. You put them in a warm room, like, oh, I'm sweating like crazy, we gotta turn the heat down, right? The hypothyroid people, it means their metabolism's turned down. How do they feel? Cold, they're always like cold, they're slow to move. Even those hyperthyroid people, usually they're really anxious. They bounce off the walls. They're really fun to take to scary movies. They're the ones that freak out and move around and everything. When they... You must be hyperthyroid, huh?
No, I can't stand people like that.
Oh.
Drives me crazy.
Okay, so metabolic rate. And we calculated this when we did the dietary journal with their basal metabolic rates, or how much energy you spend just to stay alive. So how much you're spending over a unit of time just to stay alive. And that's why that dietary journal program said, what's your average activity in a day? Are you highly active? Are you stationary? Do you lay in bed all day or not? I like to lay in bed till I come and sit in class and I go back to bed. Okay, so that term stable balance, remember, that's maintaining homeostasis, means that you're burning the same amount that you're bringing in. You keep it in balance. If you're bringing in more than you're burning, what do we know about you? You're gaining weight, and we call that a positive balance. If you're exercising a lot, you're not taking in a lot of calories, what's happening to you? You're losing weight, which we call a negative balance. Your output exceeds your input. So next, like I said, we're kind of combining different things, different concepts. We talked a little bit about digestion there with bringing nutrients in and what forms you store them in. Now we're going to talk about the brain again. So the appetite center in the brain, you already know this. What is it? The hypothalamus. Remember freezing, feeding, fighting, fornicating? It's the hypothalamus, feeding. So you have appetite centers in the hypothalamus that make you crave eating, but you also have satiety centers that make you do what? Feel full. Yep. So there's a switch in your brain that goes off when you've taken in the right amount of calories. It goes off. Mine's clearly very broken. But it's a lot of different inputs. It's not just in the brain. It's also things like inputs coming from fat cells. When you fill up your fat cells, the fat cells release a chemical that go to your brain and say, whoa, we're full down here. Back off the intake. Again, I don't listen to that chemical. Especially at like 1 o'clock in the morning when I wake up. And I go, I could use a snack. That part of my brain must be clearly shut off. Right? So here are the different pathways you have to know. This is really the introduction to going into endocrine system that we talk about next, well, after Thanksgiving. When we start talking about endocrine system. So look at this chart, look at this flow chart and watch the way it works. It's a pathway. This is like the heart of physiology, understanding the paths. So remember, anatomy was just the structure, but learning the pathways, just like we talked about with the heart. You know the structures, now it's the pathway to flow. What's changing it? So what kind of feedback loop do you think we're going to keep talking about now? Negative feedback loops. Yep. We're going to talk about things that turn off the feedback loop and what turn on the feedback loop. We're going to talk about all the maze-like pathways that work with it. So when we start talking about fat stores, we're talking about what type of cells? Adipocytes. They store adipose, so fat. That chemical I talked about is called leptin. So when your adipocytes start filling up, they get really full, they start releasing this chemical called leptin that says, whoa, we're full down here. What's it going to make your brain think? Eat a little bit more? Stop eating. So when your fat cells are full, it tells your brain, we've got plenty of fat, just for the love of God, stop eating the ice cream. And this sounds kind of funny, but it's actually true. Some people, this is broken. Like I said, I think mine's broken. But in some people, they think there's a genetic problem where this leptin doesn't work anymore. So what's that going to make them feel like? Are they ever going to feel full? No, they always want to munch. They always want to eat. So they think that's one of the genetic factors that might be contributing to obesity. It might be this leptin pathway is broken. So it could be any part of the pathway. It's just like in the nervous system where we said you start with one section, go to the next, go to the next, go to the next, and any part in that pathway that breaks, the whole pathway breaks. What if the adipocytes don't release leptin? What's going to happen to you? Your brain is never going to know that you're full. Yep, so it keeps making you want to eat. What if this thing doesn't have a proper carrier in the blood to get through your system? Will it make it to the brain? Nope. So your adipocyte's working fine, but does the brain ever know that you're full? Nope. So it keeps wanting to eat. What if the receptors that are sensitive to leptin in the brain aren't there? Never going to know. Yep, never knows. So if you break any of that pathway, then this leads to obesity. You can keep gaining weight because you never feel full. So think about pathways. All right. Next, structures, arcuate nucleus, and that's in the hypothalamus. This is a part where leptin binds to. So if leptin makes you feel full, what center would that be? Appetite or satiety center? Satiety. It makes you feel satisfied. So think satisfied with satiety. It makes you feel like you're done eating. So the leptin comes up here to this thing called the arcuate nucleus. It binds to the receptors and tells the hypothalamus we're full down below, stop eating. Right. And then to a smaller extent, that leptin will actually tell the hypothalamus, turn up my metabolism to make me do what with that full fat storage area? Back it off just a little bit. It helps me burn a little bit of calories, so it increases my metabolic rate. Okay. Next chemical, neuropeptide Y. By the way, this is traveling through the blood. What's it called?
Hormone.
A hormone. Neuropeptide Y, also a hormone. Instead of being like leptin that turns on the satiety centers, neuropeptide Y turns on the appetite centers. What's going to make you want to do? Eat. Yeah. So it makes you want to eat. It also turns down your metabolic rate. Because when neuropeptide Y comes out, it thinks, oh my gosh, we're almost out of food, storage food. So let's slowly burn what we have left so that we have enough to get us to the next meal. So it turns down your metabolism. What's that going to do to your weight gain? If you're turning down your metabolism, it's going to promote gaining weight. And this also makes you want to eat. What's that going to do to your weight? Make you gain weight. So leptin makes you lose weight, makes you feel satisfied, where neuropeptide Y makes you hungry, makes you gain weight, and turns down your metabolism. Next chemical, the melanocortins, they also work on the hypothalamus. It's like a chain reaction, and I'll show you the pathway in the next slide. But these melanocortins, they inhibit the hypothalamus and they decrease your food intake. What do they work with? Do they work with neuropeptide Y or leptin? They work with leptin. And then here's where it gets a little bit sticky. So we know leptin and neuropeptide Y, are they buddies or they hate each other? They can't be further from opposites, right? They don't like each other. So what do you think leptin is going to do to neuropeptide Y? Activate it or inactivate it? Inactivates it. Leptin tries to stop neuropeptide Y from working. What do you think leptin's going to do to the melanocortins? Increase their activity. They want the same goal, so the leptin and the melanocortins are going to work together. So if you put it into a flow chart, this is the way your book puts together, and get used to this with endocrine hormones and chemicals. Your body stores release leptin. The leptin goes to what organ in the body? It comes from the fat cells and goes to the, what part of the brain? Hypothalamus, right? It goes to the hypothalamus, that arcuate nucleus, and it's going to stimulate the release of melanocortins. It's going to stop the release. The little minus sign means inhibit. It stops the release of neuropeptide Y. If I stop neuropeptide Y, neuropeptide Y's pathway is what? Going to work well or stop? It stops. It's just like if you had a series of light switches you had to turn on to get through a house. If you don't turn the first one on, the other ones aren't going to work. So it's a series. You have to turn them all on in series. If you shut off neuropeptide Y, it shuts off this whole appetite center. Okay. If you turn on leptin and you turn on the melanocortins, what center is it going to turn on? Appetite or satiety? Satiety. So the melanocortins make you feel full. They're going to go over here to this other pathway, and just in case leptin didn't shut this pathway off completely, look what they're doing to that pathway. It's a second shutoff switch. Yep. So they're going to make sure that that one doesn't work. So the leptin, look, like I said, this gets a little bit messy, but the leptin's going to shut off neuropeptide Y and turn on melanocortins. The melanocortins are going to come over here and shut off this next hormone to make sure that it doesn't work at all. The next hormone is called orexins, and I always remember that this is going to be what? Is it going to be an appetite stimulant or depressant? This pathway is the appetite stimulant, right? And I look at the orexins, and it always makes me crave an Oreo. Every time I see that O-R-E-Exin. Here's a fun fact. Orexins are actually chemically similar to something called a cannabinoid. A cannabinoid. What's it sound like? Cannabis. Which is what? In the Maui Wowie, right? So, and if you know, I'm sure nobody here has ever touched that stuff, but you've heard that when people take the reefer, how do they feel afterwards? They get the Oreo munchies, right? So they get the munchies. Because this chemical that looks like a cannabinoid stimulates this pathway and makes them want to eat. Yeah, so it makes them want to eat. And that's what helps me remember orexin, Oreos. Makes me hungry. And then the cannabinoid is just a fun fact. All right. So what I want to know is if you have enough leptin in your body and you have cannabinoids in your body, will they actually neutralize each other? I don't know. I'm curious about that. I wonder if I can get funding for that. So you find a bunch of people that are overweight, and then you get scientific funding to give them really good weed and see what happens. Do they get the munchies as much as somebody that's scrawny? Just thinking out loud. We're brainstorming here. All right, so leptin, and I think Mercy might fund that one. Probably not. So melanocortins, remember, they are going to stimulate the satiety pathway. They're going to turn off the appetite pathway. So now melanocortins are going to find another friend to help them out, and it's called corticotropin. And what's interesting is this corticotropin is also going to be stimulated in the mornings when you first wake up. And I'll tell you about that a little bit when we get into the endocrine system. So these corticotropins, they also go to the adrenal gland and release something called cortisol. But this whole pathway is there for appetite suppression. This pathway, over here from neuropeptide Y to orexins, this is for appetite. So I already listed or went through these, but the orexins, you can see potent food stimulator. It looks like Oreo, so it makes you hungry. Neuropeptide Y turns on the orexins. Melanocortins turn off the orexins. And this is why one chemical, like one drug that does one thing in the body, doesn't usually work very well, because look at this pathway. I mean, if you were taking a diet pill that just shut off one of these chemicals, you've got other ones that are trying to turn off and on the pathways at other sites. It's just kind of a mess. All right, and then corticotropin, remember, is going to turn up your satiety centers, not make you feel like I don't want to eat. So it works with the melanocortins, works with or against the neuropeptide Y. And this last part, the nucleus tractus salitaris in the brainstem, and this processes the final signal to make you stop eating. So it starts in the hypothalamus and it sends the signal down. Reticular activating center, remember, was going straight through the brainstem. And that's the final step or the final pathway. Have you ever seen this word before? Cholecystokinin. Yes. What's its abbreviation? CCK. So remember when you see it in the book or you see it in tests or whatever, it might be abbreviated as CCK. But cholecystokinin, normally it's released down the duodenum, and what's it help you do? So food moves into the duodenum, the cholecystokinin gets released, goes to the pancreas, and it's released because of the presence of fats and proteins. So what's it going to make you do? Release an enzyme that helps you break apart fats and proteins, right? So how did cholecystokinin get from the duodenum over to the pancreas? What is it? What kind of chemical is it? It's a hormone. How to get over to the pancreas? To the blood. Is the blood specific going just to the pancreas? Nope. So it goes up to the brain too. And that's a fun thing, tricky but fun thing about hormones, is usually they don't have just one specific site. Usually they have several sites in the body they work. But what does a hormone have to be able to work? That organ has to have a what on the surface of it? A receptor. It has to have a receptor. Okay, so we've already talked about the pancreas obviously has receptors for cholecystokinin. Those little CNR cells, they dump out the enzymes that help you digest proteins and fats and carbs. And now we're finding that there's actually a signal up in the brain, or a receptor up in the brain. So when cholecystokinin is released because the duodenum's full of food, what's it going to tell your brain, just by common sense? Feed me more, eat more. It's going to say, stop eating. So what side of that pathway do you think it's going to choose? The satiety or the appetite center? The satiety. It's going to turn up the satiety. What's it going to do to your appetite center? Turn it down. Yeah. So just watch the flowcharts, watch the pathways. So if you got asked a question like this, a hormone made by adipose tissue that suppresses appetite, it's leptin. Yeah. All of these other ones are made and released in what organ? We only talked about 2 organs in this pathway. It's got to be either the adipose or the hypothalamus, so it must be hypothalamus, 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 adipose. All right, so that's the hormone balance, the hormone regulation. That's from up here. So you saw the pathway that turns off you're wanting to eat food. You saw the pathway that turns on you're wanting to eat food. What's the pathway that turns it off called? The satiety pathway. The one that turns it on is called the appetite pathway. So those are hormone regulators. There are other things. There can be gastrointestinal distension. So your GI tract's full of food. What's it going to tell you? Stop eating. It's not from a hormone pathway this time. It's actually from a neural pathway. So you have receptors that detect what? Stretch, that go to the brain and say, stop eating, man. Okay? If you have high glucose use, it's going to inhibit your food intake. You're busy burning the glucose. You don't have time to digest it. Right? The next, insulin. So when insulin is released, it's usually because you just did what? You just ate a big meal. So it's just like a backup plan. Insulin's released when your tummy's full of sugar and you're absorbing those sugars through your GI tract. So it inhibits your food intake. And then that cholecystokinin we just mentioned. So cholecystokinin goes to the pancreas and tells it to release enzymes because you're full of fat and protein in your digestive tract. It's going to go to the brain and do the same thing. Say, we're packed down here, quit sending stuff. What do these all have in common? Smell, taste, texture, stress, anxiety, depression, just knowing food's available. These are all what kind of factors? Psychological. Yeah, they're all psychological factors. These are all revolving actually around what part of the brain? Conscious smell, conscious taste, conscious texture, conscious stress, conscious anxiety, conscious depression, conscious the cerebral cortex. Yep. So have you ever walked into a room after a big meal but you smell warm pumpkin pie? Screw it, I'll have one piece, right? You ever, well, I was about to say, you ever walked into my mom's kitchen and smelled her food? Totally an appetite suppressor. But it can go either way. Love my mom. I always volunteer to cook Thanksgiving because I don't like the way my mom cooks. Well, you heard the story. My mom loves to use Crisco grease on everything, so just take a pass. Anybody ever been turned off by the texture of food? Bananas, sushi, etc. Right? Stress, anxiety, depression. You ever had one of those days when you just feel so down that you want a piece of chocolate cake? You ever had one of those days where you feel so down you can't even eat? So it can go either way. Right? And the amount of available food. So we have a McDonald's on every corner that if you're sitting at a stoplight and you think, screw it, I'll have a McShake. I need an apple pie. So just having highly available, easy to process food and enough funds or change in your pocket to get something off the dollar menu makes you want to drive through. Right? So there are a lot of factors that go into your appetite. It's not just that leptin chemical. There's a lot of stuff going on. People's stress or anxiety levels can affect it. Okay. How fast they process food through your GI tract affects it. Right. And then, of course, we talk about the disorders. So looking at the different disorders, obesity. When you look at obesity, there are lots of causes. If there were one cause, we could target it and get rid of it, but it's not. Right. So some of the problems, disturbances in the leptin signaling pathway, I already talked about that. Sometimes it's a genetic problem. So have you ever noticed that sometimes when people have heavy, overweight parents, that they have a tendency to be heavy themselves? What they find is that same heaviness can actually happen in twin studies where they separate twins. And one twin and the other twin both gain weight even though one's living in a household where they're like nutrition fanatics. It's not always because of habits. It's not always because of the habits you grew up with. It's sometimes because of a genetic problem. And then lack of exercise, of course, what's that doing to your balance? A positive balance or a negative balance? Lack of exercise is a negative balance. Yeah. It's busy lifestyles. We get busier and busier and busier. It seems like the more conveniences we have in our life, the more busy we get. Number 3, differences in the fidget factor. You know those people, don't you? You sit around a table with them. I see that as Kristen shaking her leg up here back and forth. You know, in my family, we're all like that. And you probably notice me, I fidget constantly. But at Thanksgiving, it's always entertaining because we're sitting at the table. We don't even have to ask to pass the food. Everybody's bouncing their leg. The table vibrates, and it's like one of those games where the things just move around the table. You just wait, and as it's passing by from the shaking, you take a scoop and you wait. It's like a conveyor belt. But it's called the fidget factor. Some people just have that higher metabolism that they are constantly just bouncing and moving. They call it non-exercise activated thermogenesis. NEAT. It's neat. But it actually has a name, yeah. Non-exercise activated thermogenesis. It's the fidget factor. They're burning calories, but they're not exercising. They're moving their muscles, but it's not exercise. It's just fidgeting. Those people that are constantly tapping like they've been drumming all their life. Yeah. It must be just me. Number 4. So differences in extracting food from energy. They find that some people are actually better at extracting the nutrients. So their body has better enzymes. They can process the food and bring the food in. And we know that's true because think of just one example, lactose intolerant. Obviously, are they good at extracting sugars? Clearly not from lactose, right? So lactose intolerance is just an example of that. Some people, they don't release enough pepsin. They don't release enough trypsin. Not enough chymotrypsin. So they're not going to process what? Very well. Pepsin, trypsin, chymotrypsin, procarboxypeptidase. What do they all have in common? They break apart proteins. So if you can't break the proteins small enough, you can't extract the nutrients. If you can't break the sugars down, like in lactose intolerance, you can't extract those nutrients. Right? Hereditary tendencies, that kind of goes back here to the leptin too, but it may not just be that genetic pathway. It might be, something like the extraction of the food. Maybe the genes for taking the nutrients out of the food isn't where it should be. Number 6, development of an excessive number of fat cells as a result of overfeeding. When people get heavy and they lose lots of weight, what do they always tell them? It's always easier to put it back on. Yeah, when you start building those extra storage sites, it's like building a pantry on your house. Even if you don't stock the pantry, it's there. It's super easy. You can go to the grocery store and stock that pantry in no time. So these people build these extra fat cells. They lose a lot of weight, but the fat cells are there. What do though? They just flattened out. Yeah, so they're still there. They're just waiting. And as soon as they start eating a lot of calories, and boop, they pop right back out. And number 7, or did I skip over one? Nope. Number 7, existence of certain endocrine disorders. What was that disorder I mentioned earlier where people's body temperature is really high, and if they are low in it, their body temperature is really low? Thyroid. Yeah, thyroid is a perfect example. And we'll talk about thyroid hormone 2 weeks from now, after Thanksgiving. But people with hyperthyroidism, are they going to be obese? Not typically. Who's going to be the obese one? People with hypo. Their metabolism slows down because that thyroid regulates metabolism. When it slows down, their metabolism slows. So the more calories they take in, the more they store because they're not burning them. And so we'll talk about that in better detail later. Heck, even number 1 is an endocrine disorder because it's leptin. What is leptin? It's a hormone. It's an endocrine structure. And then number 8, an abundance of convenient, highly palatable, energy-dense, relatively inexpensive foods. And I just gave you a perfect example of that. McDonald's. Yep. Any convenient shop on every corner makes it super easy for us to get those nutrients. Right. And then number 9, they think there might be an actual virus link. The common cold may carry a virus that gets into your brain and disturbs this leptin pathway or the hypothalamus. Yeah. So lucky you if you've never had a cold, huh? Right. Other disorders, so the extreme opposite, anorexia nervosa, and what's the one that usually goes hand in hand? Bulimia. Yep. So anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa are both disorders that are causing the people to do what? Not gain weight, lose weight. When I was getting my psych degree, they really pushed back then, it's not so much now, but they pushed anorexia and bulimia as being a psychological disorder of control. It's all about control. Anorexics, they are the masters of control, and they believe that the reason that they're masters of control is because they've lost control in their life and they didn't like it, and the only thing that they actually have absolute control over is what in their life? Them. They have control of what's going on inside their body in this situation. They can control not eating. What's interesting is that when you put them in an MRI and you show them things like chocolate cake or whatever, that little structure called the nucleus accumbens lights up. But it's not because they're craving that chocolate cake, because they're addicted to that feeling of control. When you show them the cake, you let them smell the cake, and they say no, it makes them feel good about it. So it's a psychological disorder, not a physiological disorder. They have actually found there's some physiological connections that are the same thing as with opiates. They activate that nucleus accumbens, and they start causing problems in there. And they found that a lot of these people, they also suffer from addictive behaviors too. So have a tendency to be excessive smokers. They have a tendency to get hooked on things like gambling or drugs or opiates. Right? So psychological. But anorexics, they starve themselves. They control themselves and they don't eat. What about bulimics? What do? What makes them different? Binge and purge. Yeah. And it's the same thing. It's a control issue, except they lost control and then they feel regretful, and then what do? They either vomit it up, they try and purge it that way, or how else can you purge calories? Excessive exercising. Or they can take a laxative and shoot right through them. Yeah. So anorexia and bulimia. And the way that they work, they're both psychological control issues, but one has a tendency to lose control and then regretfully does behaviors to correct it, where the other one's just really good at control. All right, and then the last section, the temperature regulation and balance. And this is all about what organ in the body again? Hypothalamus. Yep, it's the freezing instinct, remember? So the heat regulation. Your body temp should range between 96 and 99.9. That's a normal range. So when you go to bed at night and you're sleeping, what happens to your body temperature? It starts dropping. Yeah, and then in the morning when you get up, it starts rising again to embrace the day. But on average, it's about 98 degrees. Some people are just naturally high all day. Some people are just naturally low all day. Right. And then when you monitor body temperature, of course, there are lots of different ways. You can monitor at the surface, so you can stick the little pad to the surface of their skin. And it accounts for the surface of the skin is going to be a little bit cooler than the rest of the body. You can stick it in their mouth. You can stick it in axillary. Where's axillary at? Armpit. Yep. And then to get the most accurate measurement of the core temperature, you actually have to go for the core. So you stick that little turkey thermometer in the rear. Right. Hopefully you're not, yeah, I'm just thinking Thanksgiving. But so rectal temperature actually brings it closer to core temperature. It gives you a more accurate measurement of core, which is about 1 degree higher than taking it from the surface anywhere. Okay, so your central core, that would be the abdominal, thoracic organs, central nervous system, skeletal muscles. This is what your body's trying to maintain. Your surface temperature can change and fluctuate with about 30 degrees. So you can go from being, like on your surface, you can go from being 99 up to like 104, 105 at the surface, as long as your core is not that hot. Because if your core starts getting that hot, what do you start doing to try and cool everything off? You start sweating. And the same thing, when you go outside and you're not wearing enough warm protective clothing, have you ever felt your skin? It feels what? Definitely not 98 degrees. It feels cold. But your core is going to stay there at 100. So your outer shell can fluctuate, and you can see between 68 to 104 going up and down. So I guess that's closer to a 40, about 35.5 degree. How about we do that one? But the outer shell can change, but your central core is very fixed. In fact, your central core is regulated down to 1/100th of a percent, or 100th of a degree. So if it goes from 100.00 to 100.01, your body starts going, uh-oh. And it starts doing things to accommodate. What's it going to do if it goes from 100.00 to 100.01? Yep, you're going to start breathing a little bit heavier. You're going to start sweating. Why breathing heavier? What are you doing? You're blowing out heat, exactly. So think of dogs in that situation. When they get hot, what do? They pant. Yep, they start breathing heavier. They pant. Right, so normal variations in core for lots of different reasons. You have this biological clock, your day-night cycles. They call diurnal cycles. So remember, when you're sleeping, it's going to drop a little bit, and then during the day, it's going to go up and up and up, and in the evening, it's going to peak, and then you go to sleep, and it starts dropping again. So it depends on what time of day you're looking. And then, of course, for women, because of that chemical progesterone, it makes a flux. So right about what time of their cycle do they raise their body temperature? Yep, right at ovulation. So right there at ovulation, their body temperature goes up at about 1 degree Fahrenheit. Just a little tiny spike. So if they're measuring it every day at the exact same time, they should be pretty consistent. And then that day they notice that 1 degree spike, then they just ovulated. And we'll talk about that the last week of class. Right? And then during exercise, of course, is common sense. Your muscles, all that friction, all the increased metabolism, you're burning lots of energy, you're making lots of heat. And then extreme temperatures, like those people that go out and do the marathons, Ironman marathons and whatnot. So all these things can vary. Even in the cold, you go outside in the cold, chilly day with a t-shirt on, it's going to change your surface temperature. Right? Heat input versus heat output. If your input exceeds your output, what do they call it? What kind of balance? Input exceeds output. A negative or a positive balance? It's a positive balance. What's happening to your body temperature? You're heating up. Yep. So external environment and internal heat production starts going up. So maybe you're exercising would be an example. Maybe you're sitting in a really hot room. That would be another example that creates input. And then outputs, when you're sweating a lot or you're a cold environment, you're trying to get rid of it. Or panting a lot would do it too. So it's all about the balance again. Inputs versus exputs. Right? These 4 processes you need to know. So ways you can get rid of heat, or actually some of these could attempt to bring you in. But radiation, you ever been so close to somebody you didn't touch them, but you actually say, gosh, you're radiating heat. So you can feel the heat, but you're not actually touching them. With the sun, do you ever touch the sun? No, it's heat radiating from the sun that's actually affecting you. Form of UV radiation. And we actually have devices that we can look at people, special cameras, you can look at them, you can see how much heat they're radiating from different parts. You can do it with your house too. So one process is losing heat, you can radiate heat out of you and get rid of it. Right? Same thing is you can take it in. So the sun radiates heat on you and it increases your body temperature. Conduction means you actually have to touch the substance. So if you're conducting heat, heat works on a concentration you can grade it to. The more heat you have, if you touch something that has lower heat, what happens to the heat? You have high heat, it has low heat, the heat goes where? Down into the lower heat until they both hit equilibrium. Yep. So if this thing is hotter than you, where's the heat go? Down into you. You touch a hot stove, it's high heat, it goes into you, and what's it do to your tissue? Burns your tissue. You touch a snowball, where's the heat going? From your hand to the snowball, until the snowball does what? It melts, yep, and then eventually that water goes to equilibrium. Right, and then convection. Anybody here have a convection oven? What's different about a convection oven than a conventional oven? It has one thing that makes it different. It has a fan. That's the only difference. It has a fan, right? So convection is talking about moving by waves of air or water. That's convection. So what they do is, in a normal oven, you have this radiant heat source, right? The radiant heat is that big thing that glows, or the fire down at the bottom, and whatever's closer to it gets more exposure. What they do is they put a fan under there, and it blows that heat around, and it moves it by convection. So you have less radiant heat and more of that even distribution, so that you cook your foods evenly. The same thing works with you. If you're in a room that's 104 degrees in that room, and you turn a fan onto you in a closed room, what are you doing to you? You're just evenly cooking you. So you want to get in a room that's cooler than you, and that's why we don't lay out in the sun with a fan on us. What do? We get into a shaded area where it's a little bit cooler, and then we put the fan on us to take the heat away. Yeah, convection is moving by water or air movement. And then evaporation is when you take and you change its state. So you take water and you take it from water, changing its state to a what? Where it leaves you? A gas, an air. Yeah, so it turns into air. And that's in the form of what? Sweat. You push the water up to the surface of your body, it's holding energy, it's holding the heat. And then what you need is when it evaporates, it changes and takes the heat away from you. So if you're exercising really, really hard and you wipe all that sweat off, you've just defeated the purpose of the sweat. The sweat was there to help take the heat out of your body. If you dry off your body, that heat stays in you. So the next time you're at the gym and you're exercising really, really hard, you're sweating all over the place, don't wipe it off. Look at the guy next to you. If they look really hot, give them a big hug. Rub some of that sweat on them. Share it. Don't be stingy. What? I would do it for you. I'm kidding. So here are some examples. So when you sit down on a chair, if the chair is cold, what's actually happening?
Heat's going into the chair.
Yep, heat's going into the chair by what form? Forget the radiation down here. Conduction. If it's coming off the sun and going into you, what's that? Radiation. What if there's a cool breeze over the fire and it's blowing the hot air onto you? Convection. Yep. So there's a snowball back and forth. Snowball, where's the heat going? From high U to low snowball, right? And then a heating pad where it's 110 degrees, it's going from where? 110 into U, high to low. And there's your convection with the current. And then evaporation, of course, is sweating. So transfer of heat between objects of differing temperature or in direct contact is what? Conduction. Yeah. All right, so the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus integrates a multitude of thermosensory inputs. It's not just the sensors in the hypothalamus, it's also sensors in your core. So the hypothalamus is the primary thermostat, and it's regulating everything body temperature around you. Even your skin. So if your skin gets cold, what's interesting is what's it do to the blood vessels in your skin? Squeezes them. It's like, screw you, skin. If you're cold, we're going to get cold next, and it's bringing the heat back in. But like I said before, you've got that 1/100th of a degree difference. So if you go from 100.00 to 100.01, your hypothalamus knows that, and it changes. It's very sensitive to change. And of course, the receptors, since it's the brain, it has to have a receptor that sends an afferent signal to the brain. So the receptors, if they're peripheral, they're out in the skin. If they're central, they're in your core. Brain down into your visceral organs. So central's in the core, peripheral's out on the surface. And so signals come from both directions. The skin temperature goes to the hypothalamus and tells it what the external environment is, so the hypothalamus can anticipate what it's going to need to do. And then your core, if your core starts shivering, so if you ate a whole gallon of ice cream really fast, or ice cubes or something like that, your peripheral receptors aren't going to change very much, but your cores are going to change. So that's just one example where one could change and not the other. Right. So what you need to look at are pathways again. If your body temperature starts changing, what kind of behavioral adaptations do you think you're going to go through? Think about it. If you're cold, what do? That's not behavior. That's a physiological. You start putting on warm clothes, right? You start seeking shelter. You ever stayed at a friend's overnight, like on their couch? You fell asleep watching the TV and it was cold in their house. When you wake up, what do you notice about your environment? You're like covered in the pillows. You're covered in whatever piece of covering you could find around you. The last time I remember doing that, I stayed at a friend's house, and I woke up with this rug on top of me. So I was so cold, and I wasn't awake when I did that. I was cold, and my instincts, my behavioral instincts was cover up. If you're outside, you start covering yourself in leaves and grass, right? You start seeking shelter. It's a behavioral instinct. You think you're in control, you're not. And that's like the rug incident, you know. I'm like, what the? Oh my God, a rug. This dog probably peed on that rug and everything. I wasn't even thinking. I was just thinking it's warm, right? Survival. All right, so the motor neurons. If you're cold, what are the motor neurons going to do? Motor. What are they controlling? They're controlling skeletal muscles, so they're going to make you start shivering, right? So you start shivering. The sympathetic nervous system, what's it going to do? It controls your blood vessels. What's it going to do to your blood vessels if you're cold? It's going to constrict them, squeeze them down. What's it trying to do? Push the blood as much into the core as it possibly can, and into the brain, right? And the sympathetic nervous system, if you're too cold, what's it going to do to your sweat glands? Shut them off, right? So when are the sympathetic nervous system going to turn on sweat glands? Only when you're too hot. Yep. So here's what shivering is. It's oscillating activity of skeletal muscle. It's about 10 to 20 times per second. And what's it doing for you? Helping you cool off or heat up? Heat up. Another process called non-shivering thermogenesis. What's thermogenesis mean? Heat creation, right? So you're not shivering, but you're creating heat. Usually you see this more in babies and other animals. But in babies, they're born with something called brown fat. And the brown fat doesn't have to be turned into sugar and all that. It just goes through this metabolic combustion. It's kind of like those little glow sticks. There's just something in there that when you click them, they work on their own. It's like magic. But this brown fat's magical. As soon as you turn it on, it starts creating heat. They don't have to shiver for the heat. Right? Same thing with animals, like bears in the wintertime. They've got all this brown fat. When their body gets cold, they start burning the brown fat internally, and it increases their heat. The older we get, the less brown fat we have. So how's your grandmother feel in her house? I'm so cold, turn up the heat. Wait, that's my grandmother. Never mind. So always cold. Her house is like 110 degrees. She's like, give me a blanket. Right? Magnitude of heat loss can be adjusted by varying flow through the skin, and we've already talked about this. What's the name of the organ that's adjusting this? The hypothalamus. Yep. So if the hypothalamus detects that your skin temperature is dropping, what's it do to the blood vessels? Squeezes them. What's it doing to your heat loss? Turning it down. It's reducing the blood flow to the surface, so you have less evaporation going off the body. You have less convection going off the body, less radiation going off the body. So if you vasodilate the arterioles of the skin, you're trying to lose heat. So increase heat loss. If you're constricting them, you're trying to decrease the heat loss. And of course the hypothalamus again. This you might want to put a little star by. So when you have a cold exposure, it's the back part. The posterior hypothalamus increases heat production, makes you shiver, makes you turn on that non-shivering thermogenesis. Makes you instinctively cover up, put on warm clothes, protect yourself. Makes you do what? Stand up straight or curl up into a ball? Curl up into a ball. Yeah, you ever notice when you wake up cold, you're like in the fetal position. You didn't think to do that, you just did it. It's the hypothalamus controlling that instinct. Right? So if you're trying to decrease heat loss, you vasoconstrict, your postural changes. What did I just tell you? If you're trying to decrease heat loss, what do posturally? Curl up in a ball, fetal position. And it's because of the back part of the hypothalamus. So if you go outside during the winter in a short sleeve t-shirt and no coat, how will your body compensate? Lay down in the snow, make snow angels, stretch your arms and legs as far as you can, holding that position. Yeah, kind of know. Right. Will you vasodilate on the skin? What color would that turn your skin if you vasodilated? Red. That doesn't happen out in the wintertime. Do you start sweating out there? Nope. You start shivering. Right. And the next one, the anterior part. So posterior, remember you were trying to keep warm. The anterior part is to help you decrease heat production and help you lose heat. All the opposite. So it's going to make you make heat. So what's it going to do? It's going to decrease your heat production. What's it going to make you do to your muscles? It's going to make you lazy, right? You ever been around when it's so hot outside? Do you want to do exercise? Do you want to go for a long walk? No, you just want to lay down and sprawl out on the couch in the shade, right? You don't want to do anything. You think that you did that on purpose, but it was your body, your brain telling you, hey man, it's too hot, don't move. Right? And then it increases heat loss. What's going to happen to your blood vessels? They open up. What's going to happen to your skin? It turns very red so that you can evaporate off that heat. And then when you're really hot, you want to peel off your clothing, right? 5 minutes left. Thanks for the tip. All right, so here's a question. If you go outside in the middle of the summer and it's over 100 degrees, which of the following are you going to do? Are you going to start shivering? No, because that's going to increase heat production. Are you going to curl up in a ball? Nope. You're going to sprawl out. Are you going to wear black wool sweaters? Nope. So even your brain knows that when you're not thinking. And number 4, skin vasodilation. It's got to be that. It opens it up, acts like a radiator, and cools your body. All right, and the last one. So fever. Fever is a natural process. Fever is good to an extent. Fever is there to help you get rid of something that shouldn't be in your body. Anytime you have an infection, no matter what it is, you have a slight fever because of it. If something gets into your bloodstream or into your internal tissues that doesn't belong there, your body has these mechanisms to tell the hypothalamus, crank up the heat, we're going to cook this sucker out. So fever, what happens is the hypothalamus is like the thermostat on your wall. It's set at 100 degrees core temperature. What happens when you're running a fever is that it says, okay, well maybe we need to turn this core up to kill whatever's inside of us. So it turns up to 101. If it didn't kill the invader, it says, well, let's go to 102. If it didn't kill the invader, it goes to 103, 104, until it either kills the invader or kills you. Something's going to die that day, right? So it keeps cranking up the heat. That's what the hypothalamus does. It resets. So your brain is telling you, if you're normally at 100 degrees in your core and your hypothalamus goes up to 104, what's the hypothalamus going to start doing to get you to 104? It's going to tell your body to start shivering. What's it going to do to the blood vessels at the surface of your skin? Constrict. Yep. What's it going to make you want to do? Lay out flat and sprawl out, or curl up in a ball? Curl up in a ball. When you get a fever, when you initially get the fever, how do you feel? Cold. But if you take your temperature, what's going on inside? Your temperature is higher than normal, but on the outside you're shivering. You feel cold. You feel cold and clammy skin, right? It's because your hypothalamus is telling you, crank it up, we're trying to kill this. How do you feel when you break a fever? Suddenly, when you break the fever, when these chemicals that were being released because of an invader in your body, suddenly the hypothalamus goes, well, the invader's gone. What the hell are we doing at 104? This is crazy. It turns the temperature back down to 100, but your body's at 104. What are you going to start doing? You sweat. What are you going to start doing body posture-wise? Sprawling out. You start ripping your clothes off. You know, when you're in bed and you've been freezing all night with like 40 blankets on top of you, and then suddenly you break the fever, what do? Throw them all off. You're like peeling off your pajamas and you're laying there sweating to death because you can't handle it. The chemicals that go through your body are called endogenous pyrogens. What's that telling you? Fire generator. Endogenous means your body's making these. The white blood cells, when they detect an invader, they start dropping this chemical in the blood. It starts traveling through the blood, goes up to the hypothalamus and says, we've got an invader, you need to cook them. Right? And then when it gets into the hypothalamus, it releases something called a prostaglandin, and the prostaglandins are the chemicals that bump the chemical temperature up. So the pyrogens travel through your blood, get to the hypothalamus releases a prostaglandin and bumps that up a little bit. So prostaglandins, by the way, are inhibited by aspirin and Tylenol. So why do you take aspirin and Tylenol? To reduce that temperature. It stops the prostaglandins so that your hypothalamus will go back to the normal. Normal level. And you can look through the pathway. I just explained it to you. So when you have a fever, how come you shiver? You're trying to lose heat to bring down your temperature? Nope. Are you trying to produce heat to reach your new thermostat set point? Yes. And you're trying to lose heat to let the white blood cells fight the microorganisms. Doesn't even make sense. How about you're trying to produce heat by arterial vasodilation? You're shivering. You're just vasoconstricted. It doesn't even happen. So hyperthermia is telling you what? Hyper means excessive or too much. Thermia is heat. Yep. Hyperthermia is not a fever. This is not a fever. This is when your body temperature goes higher than it wants to go. So exercise-induced hyperthermia, every time you jump on a treadmill and you run 7 miles, you get this. Because your body temperature goes up higher than it wants to, what do you do to compensate? You start sweating. Yeah, you do mechanisms to try and sweat or get rid of the heat. This pathologic hyperthermia, this is interesting because it can be caused by endocrine, like thyroid hormone, too much of it. Hyperthyroidism. Their body temperature goes up higher. There's actually something called malignant hyperthermia, where if you're exposed to anesthetics and you're genetically not friendly with anesthetics, your body temperature starts cranking up, so you can die on the operating table by overheating. It's fun. Right. So too much thyroid hormone, too much epinephrine, or dysfunction like a stroke or tumor pushing on the hypothalamus. That's it. Thanks for the extra minute of your time. So Tuesday there's an exam. The study guide's already on Elios, and you need to do online number 9 and 10. If you're in lab, just head up to lab. Don't sign the sheet. I'll have it in lab too. So if you're in lab, head on up to lab. Don't sign the attendance sheet. I usually don't. Are you going out of town?
Yes.